Welcome to a book interview. My name is Pascal Lotta. I'm an assistant professor at the Waseda Institute for Advanced Study in Tokyo, and I have here with me today Geoffrey Alan Pigman, who is the author of this wonderful book here behind me, Negotiating Our Economic Future, Trade, Technology, and Diplomacy. I must tell you all, Geoffrey and I are good friends, and we were discussing his book recently and said, why don't we do that actually online during an interview so that we can make this available to other people who might want to watch something of it, because Geoffrey actually has a very interesting take at diplomacy studies. And thank you very much, Geoffrey, for agreeing to do this online discussion today.
Well, thank you, Pascal, for agreeing to host it. This should be really fun. I'm most grateful.
Well, let's get right into it. And for, I guess, some people might already know you, and the ones who don't, I'll just introduce you briefly. So Geoffrey is a global strategy and public policy consultant and an academic focusing on diplomacy and the politics of international trade. He has researched and taught on 3 continents, has published dozens of articles and 4 books, including Trade Diplomacy Transformed, which I actually also have here with me, and the World Economic Forum, of which I believe even Klaus Schwab ordered a couple of copies, right?
Indeed he did. Indeed he did.
And so this one is his most recent book. Here you can see it, Negotiating Our Economic Future, Trade, Technology, and Diplomacy. It's going to be published, it is published in October 2020 by Agenda Publishing and McGill Queen's University Press. So, what I find most striking about this book is that you are taking something that is quite traditional, trade and diplomacy, 2 things that are they go together. The first time somebody was trying to trade something, you needed somebody who starts negotiating about it. And, these are kind of the 2 sides of the same coin. And we in diplomacy studies, we look at these connections in various ways. And now you decided to combine that with a 3rd element, which is technology. And as far as I understand from your book, you are thinking about technology in a bigger sense, in a bigger context, also as business practice, for example, how new business practices informed by technology then lead to new forms of diplomacy, and how diplomacy vice versa also then interacts with business practices at home and abroad, and there you bring in this element of negotiation. I find that quite innovative, and I would like to ask you what gave you the idea for this and what made you write this book?
Well, as you point out, Pascal, I was already interested in and worrying about the impact of new technologies, automation, artificial intelligence on the workplace of the future, the global workforce of today, and the broader global economy. Then 2016, the Trump and Brexit elections happened. Once I got over the shock of that, I began to connect the dots between technology transformation and this sudden rise of populism and ultranationalism, racism, and so forth across the globe. I realized that how we've been thinking about international trade is not as relevant as it used to be. It's not becoming very relevant at all. And we need to rethink how we conduct diplomacy to manage trade and economic relations if we're going to succeed at tackling the really difficult issues that we're facing. And the first one of those issues has to be the climate crisis. So my research led me to 7 critical issues that I think we need to focus domestic policy and diplomacy on, make legislation, negotiation, so forth, to address the impact of tech transformation on global trade and the the workplace of the future. So what are those issues? Climate crisis, China-Western relations, the World Trade Organization, the technology and artificial intelligence governance, the diplomatic capacity of technology firms, inequality in domestic social policies, and ramped up public diplomacy to address the tech crisis, the technology issues going forward.
Those are like your 7 main points that the book is building towards, right? I mean, I will later also show the table of contents of your book at this position, and these 7 points that you're mentioning right now, you've got them in chapter number 6. The book is kind of geared towards giving these recommendations, and your analysis works towards that place, which is why I think we should look at them in detail. Because like this whole aspect of technology then informs each one of these points. And you mentioned the first one already. The first recommendation, I mean, imperative basically, is avert ecological Armageddon. How do you get from trade diplomacy and technology to ecological Armageddon? And how would you say like negotiation, diplomacy can help us to avert it?
Right. Well, this is it. The climate crisis is where we have to start. So a lot of thinkers out there, futurists, see automation and AI as taking the global economy to what they call an age of abundance in maybe 40, 50, maybe not until 100 years, but out there where everyone on Earth will have their basic needs and then some met, and we won't have to work nearly as much or nearly as hard to live comfortably. The machines are going to do a lot of the work for us. The productivity will increase so much that we'll all live better. But to get there, there's a big if. We have to face the climate crisis head on and get a handle on it now, or else none of these other policy recommendations I'm going to talk about are even going to be relevant. But we have to lower greenhouse gas emissions by 7.6% a year for 10 years from right now, if we're going to meet the Paris Climate Accord target of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. And this has to be tackled globally. It's not going to work if only some governments do it. It's not even going to work if 80% of the governments do it. Everyone has to do it. So governments have to negotiate diplomatic agreements to implement both incentives and penalties to meeting these critical climate targets. And there are a few ideas out there of how to do that. One is a carbon tax that every country would impose on carbon emissions. It would gradually be lowered. The tax would be increased on carbon over time to make it more and more expensive to emit the same amount of carbon. Another approach is benchmarking, which is the World Economic Forum's approach for getting both firms, global firms, large firms, domestic firms, and civil society organizations to make commitments to become climate neutral or climate positive, lowering greenhouse gas emissions. A third approach is the kind of negative version of that, which we could call name and shame. So publicizing companies and countries that are not meeting their commitments. And the last another approach is a cap and trade schemes, which is a very economic way of allowing businesses and governments to trade allowances for carbon emissions in a global marketplace. And that's a natural trade issue about unfair advantage. If some countries are cheating, this could be included in the World Trade Organization. It's already getting included in bilateral trade agreements like the EU-Canada agreement, EU-Japan free trade agreement, for example.
Do you see that technology is somehow going to help with any of these 4 ways of incentivizing governments to reduce their emissions?
Well, absolutely. I mean, everything, the technologies are being developed out there all the time. Everything from smart grid technologies, smart home, and so forth to, big, more kind of sci-fi approaches such as solar shields if necessary, to orbit the Earth, that could be moved over the polar ice caps in the Arctic or Antarctic summers to limit the melting of ice, which is more a palliative measure, a temporary measure. But the technologies are out there, but we have to negotiate in such a way that we can share them, we can accelerate their development, and we can share them and make them available to everyone. You know, for example, as the developing countries continue to develop, the least developed countries, they're going to need power. But the best source of power for these countries is going to be solar. And a lot of these countries are in hot and dry parts of the world already. So one of the best things they have at their disposal is you know, massive solar systems, distribution systems, and so forth.
Okay. And in this sense, this is also a clear and direct issue for diplomacy, and diplomats in also foreign ministries tend to try to come to common understandings, right? That's the idea.
Governments can't go it alone. They're on their own. As individual countries can't do this by themselves. We have to do this together.
Okay. Thank you for that. Then you move forward, and your second recommendation is also very good and very important. Stabilize diplomacy between China and the West, because I mean we are all witnessing for the last couple of years already, and in 2020 even more, this fallout, especially between the US and China. But in a larger sense, you're expanding it and saying like the West and China. And how would we do that? And how does it play together with this technology question in diplomacy?
Yeah, well, totally. So China-Western relations have become the biggest diplomatic problem that we have in the world today. There are multiple conflicts or incipient conflicts that stretch across the range from security issues, trade issues, human rights issues. The West and China have to work together to manage the big diplomatic challenges going forward, whether we're talking about the development of artificial intelligence and the eventual emergence of super intelligent machines that can think and act way faster than we can, everything from that to what we were just discussing, climate. So the West and China are going to have to work together on these things, even if we're going to disagree about a variety of other issues. The EU relations between China and the EU right now are still reasonably stable, but China-US relations, as we've seen, have deteriorated significantly under the Trump presidency. His trade wars have failed to open markets. China has accelerated their persecution of Uyghurs and the people of Hong Kong. So this can't be about pointing fingers in the West, judging China's foreign policies. The two sides have to deal with each other as we are, because neither are going away. And as I see it, there are a few positive trends that could help us along this route. Chinese consumers, particularly younger consumers, millennials, Generation Z folks, are becoming more like Western consumers all the time. So they're consuming more experiences instead of objects and so forth. Chinese firms, likewise, even though they're more closely tied to the government there than Western firms are to governments, their interests still do diverge significantly from the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. Chinese tech firms want to be allowed to continue to do business in the West. Chinese firms have a strong incentive to keep trade open, as Western firms do. So whether we're talking about Huawei or Volkswagen, they both want to be able to do business in each other's regions. And likewise, you see other Western firms that right now that can't do business in China effectively. Firms like Facebook and Google, want to get into China, but without having to give the Chinese government access to all of their data. So that's an incentive structure for getting the two sides to work together, because diplomacy going forward, it already is this way, but it's going to be ever more this way. It's not just about government to government, but it's about governments, it's about large global firms, it's about civil society organizations, multiple types of actors, and that's just going to become more so. So that's what's on the field of play in China-Western diplomacy is different types of diplomatic actors. So an example, look at China's global economic growth strategies, things that have been succeeding so far. For example, their Belt and Road Initiative, China's Export-Import Bank, the BRICS Bank, the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, all of these things have been very effective at promoting Chinese trade with developing countries and even with countries in Europe. China's Exim Bank has provided more concessionary export financing than all the Exim banks in the G7 countries put together. But if they want to keep growing, it's going to depend on continued openness economically between China and the West. Now, on the other hand, the downside is that China's politics are not becoming more like the politics of the West. Even Reagan and Thatcher back in the day hoped that would be the case, but it isn't happening, at least not yet. Albeit the Chinese Communist Party is facing a fight for its long-term survival in power. And they have a formidable leader in Xi Jinping. So diplomacy between China and the West, as I see it, is going to depend on both sides keeping overall relations stable enough that they can work together on these key economic issues, global issues. So for example, both China and the West do depend on the continued stability of a rules-based international trading system, the WTO system. It allows for trade to be orderly and predictable. It allows both sides also to break the rules occasionally. And that's we know China does that. We know the United States does that. The EU does it occasionally too. And so all the sides need to stay committed to the WTO dispute settlement process and be committed to adhering to their rulings as much as possible.
And do you see in this game that's going on the role of technology companies like Huawei and TikTok, which both already saw, like, for example, like a crackdown in the US that then the Chinese government is complaining about, and you mentioned like Google and Amazon and so on that have problems on the Chinese market. Do you see the role of these technology companies as rather something that would bring more stability to the system, or are they a source of the opposite of like what we're seeing now, of more rivalry?
Well, I think they can be a source of stability, depending on how relations are maintained both between the firms and the Chinese government, and between these firms and, say, the Americans, the EU, the various other Western governments. And it'll tie into one of my later points about the diplomatic capacity of these firms. But I cite as an example somebody like Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, who has been enormously successful as a diplomat. He's been one of the stars at the World Economic Forum, which is a multi-stakeholder platform for global diplomatic kind of brainstorming. He's been great at that and bridged a lot of gaps, and the more people like him, especially on the Chinese side, need to rise to the top, because these firms, they don't want to be excluded from Western markets any more than Google and Facebook like being excluded from China. So I think the fact of having these different actors on the field, other than just the governments, means it opens up more possibilities for trade-offs, different types of trade-offs between the different actors, where firms will give up something to get something, governments will give up something to get something, and so forth. The same principle that applies to multilateralism between governments applies to multilateralism between governments and firms and big civil society organizations and so forth.
Thank you for that explanation. And we will come back again to exactly the point of these diplomats, modern technology diplomats, etc. But maybe let's go to your third point first, which is that you're kind of trying to shake your reader, saying we need to reform trade diplomacy's key institution, the WTO, which you wrote about also before and so on. What kind of reform is needed, and how would you do that reform? Right.
Well, first off, let's just preface this by saying that the GATT-WTO process for opening trade and maintaining open trade and governing it since World War II has been overwhelmingly successful for the most part. The WTO itself was created in 1995 by the Treaty of Marrakesh, and since the full-blown institution came into operation, it's been mostly successful at maintaining and enforcing multilateral trade rules, but it has been a bit less successful at promoting further trade liberalization. You recall the Doha Development Agenda multilateral round that went on for 15 years in the early part of this century and didn't yield many results, let's just say. So they're going to need to do better on that. Now, over time, additional regulatory areas have been added to the WTO's trade agenda and jurisdiction. So things like investment policies, intellectual property protection, labor and environmental rules, health and safety, government procurement policies, and so forth. So the trade brief has become bigger because we've come to realize a lot more things are related to trade than they initially thought when they were negotiating the GATT in the late 1940s. So to remain effective now, the WTO needs to expand this purview of trade-related policies even farther. So to encompass cross-border flows of data, information, and knowledge, to climate change mitigation, to cross-border labor flows that are related to services trade, people going back and forth to sell services or buy services. So that's expanding the purview is the first thing. Second thing is that we need to reform the institutional structure and capacities of the WTO. So we have this problem now, it's been developing over the last few years during the Trump administration, although arguably started even before that, where new members of the dispute settlement process appellate body have not been reappointed. And so there are now currently not enough people on the appellate body to hear appeals of WTO disputes. So that appellate body needs to be protected against obstruction by single member states of the WTO. So for example, by the Trump administration. This has been a big problem. So there's that. Next, on a broader sense, we need to make the institutions of the WTO more like the institutions of the European Union. Now, the EU institutions have succeeded at mediating between member states that are sovereign, and they've conducted legislation, they adjudicate disputes all between sovereign members. And they do well because the EU institutions are simultaneously diplomatic and political in how they operate. So how would that work in practice? Well, I'd say we need to move away from these long multilateral trade rounds, which have sort of run out of steam with the Doha round kind of fizzling out. And we need to move more towards doing trade diplomacy by everyday negotiating and legislating that could be driven by a WTO secretariat that comes to look more like the European Union Commission. So creating commissioners from the member states, enhancing the trade policy review function, this sort of thing. We also need to increase representation and legitimacy at the WTO. A lot of individuals, a lot of groups, various countries say there's not enough legitimacy. So how do we do that? We could create a global trade parliament, like the European Parliament. It would share decision-making authority with the WTO's council. Now, in the council itself, let's reform how voting is done in the council to, again, make it look more like how voting is done in the EU, what the EU calls qualified majority voting, QMV, which takes some account of the size and the trade volumes of the member states. So rather than giving each state necessarily an equal vote, whether it's the US or Malta or other very small countries, but not give the large states all the power and require different combinations of positive coalitions to pass new agreements to make it cross-cutting and representative. So that's another idea. Another idea yet is let's hold intergovernmental conferences for the WTO, the way the EU does, every few years, only when major rule changes are needed, fundamental rule changes are needed. So a different order for doing business. That, again, taking advantage of the EU's idea of being both diplomatic and political at the same time, because it's made up of sovereign members, and the sovereignty has to be taken seriously, but the need for cooperation and negotiation can't be overlooked.
I find this highly interesting. It's just what we saw in 2016. One of the things you mentioned is, of course, Brexit, and Brexit was to a very large extent informed or caused by this feeling of the British people thinking that they're losing sovereignty to the EU, which of course the EU is a supranational body to some extent. There is supranational decision making that then the member states cannot basically block away, right? And that was one of the reasons the UK wanted to step out. So do you think that, might there be a momentum at the moment in the 2020s for WTO overhaul in the way that you're proposing, which is quite large, right? That would be an additional structure to the United Nations, but on an like concerned with trade rules, but you're even suggesting some form of giving some form of supranationality to it. Do you think that right now in 2020 we have a momentum, or do we need to build towards a momentum?
Well, we certainly need to build on the momentum that's there now. But and one of the ways that we do that is, and I mentioned this later about the importance of public diplomacy and communicating about technology issues, but we have to think about, how do people understand what sovereignty is? Because as you see in my proposal, I'm not downplaying the sovereignty at all. And you have to start, why the EU does succeed in practice is because it recognizes the reality and the importance of the sovereignty of the members, even as it goes about doing its politics, its supranational politics. But sovereignty needs to be understood not as a zero-sum game, but as a positive sum game. So delegating some sovereignty to the WTO or to the European Union, it's not like giving away some of the sovereignty you have. It's pooling some of the sovereignty you have with others so that you can achieve more of your own objectives. Because what is sovereignty really about but the ability to achieve our objectives on the global stage? Every state in the diplomatic system is formally sovereign, has a formally sovereign equality, but that doesn't mean that Vanuatu has as much power to achieve what they want as China does, because they're different sizes and they have different amounts of wealth, per capita or in total. So we have to think about sovereignty in this way. To sovereignty means the ability to get what you need and what you want, and frequently that is going to involve pooling elements of those sovereignty through international institutions, multilateral institutions, and that's a diplomatic process.
Yeah, very diplomatic. I mean, we're seeing it right now of how difficult it is for the UK then now to come to this understanding, because at the end of the day, nobody pulls out of the world community. Nobody is perfectly above everybody else. So right. Thank you for that. The fourth point then that you're making is that you want to develop global collective norms, policies, and institutions for regulating technology development, data flows, and AI. And that's where we are coming back now to this technology issue and how you want to negotiate it. How do you think would this development of collective norms work towards these new technologies?
Yeah. Well, so this is important here because as AI develops further, and then a little bit farther down the line when super intelligence emerges, and the futurists, the experts are suggesting that maybe around 2045, give or take. So how can we be sure that this will happen in ways that benefit humanity and that don't inadvertently harm us, even in some lethal ways, which is a possibility. So technology governance needs global institutions and norms, much in the way that trade flows and trade governance need these kind of norms. And incorporating tech standards into the WTO Fair Practices Code, Fair Trade Practices Code, is a good idea, but it may not be enough. So one proposal that's been put out there is to form an alliance of democracies that would reach an agreement that would on safeguarding global data flows. lest otherwise non-democratic governments, including China, might establish policies that could be detrimental regarding data flows. And this kind of alliance could evolve into a world data organization that would be focused specifically on governance, in global governance, on data flows, information flows, knowledge flows. Western governments also are likely going to have to do more in terms of supporting firms based in the West, much in the way in terms of developing AI, as the Chinese government are already currently providing to their firms. Whether we like it or not, it's become a bit of a race, a technology race like the space race, but on developing AI. But from the Western side, we want to model AI development diplomatically as something that is going to be in the service of the public interest in democratic societies, rather than in the service of states and of governments in more authoritarian societies. So that's just a practical approach, I think, that has to be faced, and we have to go into it with that in mind.
So you wouldn't say that, the technology can take care of itself, that the industry is going to develop, standards, security protocol standards that will automatically allow for the free flow of data. You're of the opinion that we will need negotiated norms that then governments sign up to and live up to for data flow.
I think that's basically what it comes down to, because the reality is that different governments in different situations may decide that they want data flows to look very different depending on their particular agendas and needs, and we need to put that on the table for global negotiation, if not in the global public interest, then at least in the interest of governments representing their respective populations and businesses.
Thanks for that. We're seeing at the moment a world where, for example, the use of VPN is quite important to breach these firewalls that different countries put up, and that then forbid certain services. The US now joined them with forbidding TikTok. If you want to use it, then you need to switch up a VPN and so on, making interoperability impossible. And this could be solved maybe through negotiations, you're saying.
It could be. Technology is always going to try to find workarounds, as they do now. As you point out, VPN has been a way for folks living in China who want access to things that the Chinese government doesn't permit. They're doing that. But that's also going to continue to be a sort of a space race between efforts by governments to block those sorts and new technologies to get around the blockages. A much easier and less expensive, cumbersome way would be to negotiate some basic types of agreements on a multilateral basis that would include the major players. And if the major players are at the table agreeing, others will tend to fall in line so as not to be left behind or left out.
And that brings us back or forward to your fifth point, which takes us back again to scaling up diplomatic capacities of big technology firms. I think that's where you're coming back to people like Mr. Ma or Mr. Bezos, right? Right. Can you explain that? Why would these technology firms be somebody we need to analyze as diplomatic actors?
Right. Well, exactly. As I said before, these big tech firms are just as important as diplomatic actors today as many governments are. They operate in many ways analogous to governments as diplomatic actors. So they represent themselves to governments, they negotiate, they make agreements, they also communicate with the global public about what they do and why. And some firms, tech firms we've seen, have learned to do this really well over time. So Microsoft and IBM in the US, firms like Nokia and Ericsson in Europe and so forth became good at this a number of years ago. And as I said, even some Chinese firms like Alibaba under Jack Ma are doing well at it, despite facing major challenges given their more complex, tighter relationship with the Chinese government. But on the other hand, US firms-based firms like Facebook, Google, Amazon have faced really steep learning curves in how to do diplomacy over the last 20 years as these firms have kind of emerged from nowhere and grown really fast. But they still haven't gotten very good at it. I mean, you look at Zuckerberg testifying to the US Congress and to the European Parliament, it has not gone smoothly, to say the least. So these firms need to do better, not just increasing staffing for corporate diplomacy, but in learning how to communicate better and figuring out which values and to embrace and which objectives to hold up. Now, I see there's a role here potentially for the big institutional shareholders of these firms, like pension funds and mutual funds, CalPERS, TIAA-CREF, and so forth. These groups can take a lead in actually pressing the big tech firms to get better at diplomacy, because they need to do this, and they need to do it fast.
Some people, especially from democratic countries who might listen to this might argue that, but wait a moment, diplomacy is supposed to be in the done by, let's say, professionals in the name of elected governments who then represent the people, and that's the kind of diplomacy we want. We want our diplomats to negotiate good deals for us. But technology companies usually are not elected officials. So why would you say that it is still important to empower them diplomatically? Why would this be to the benefit of the people on this planet?
Well, because these firms are going to act in ways that they perceive as advancing their own interests in any event. They're doing it already simply by virtue of what they are. Well, I mean, if you're a small business, if you're running a coffee shop in the center of a city, you may complain to your local council person about regulations that hurt you, and you may ask for regulatory changes to improve things, but that's a very client based kind of relationship. But once firms reach a certain size, they actually have leverage over governments. They can say, well, we'll build a factory in Slovakia instead of Poland because Slovakia offers us a better tax deal or more lax environmental regulations and so forth. So we've moved beyond, in recent years, we've moved beyond this idea, though, that firms are entirely about shareholder value and more to an idea of stakeholder, of firms as accountable to stakeholders in a broader sense. So shareholders, yes, but also workers, the environment, the communities in which they operate, all of this sorts of things. So firms that succeed on a global scale have to think about themselves and see how they fit in and how their actions are perceived and adjust their objectives to meet this new kind of emerging global standard, which again was something that was very much endorsed at the World Economic Forum's most recent Davos summit in January. This whole idea, they call it ESG, environmental, social governance agenda for firms. So it is the reality that firms are going to be negotiating in their interests, and they're doing diplomacy, but we have to understand this as diplomacy, what they're doing, and urge them from all their stakeholders, to get all their stakeholders to urge them to move in constructive directions in dealing with these big issues.
Yeah, the big shift is, of course, from shareholders who own the company to stakeholders, which is a more global definition, which then includes the workers and even the consumers. So companies understanding themselves as bigger entities that also should work in the greater good, as we are seeing that companies are now also trying to move green, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right, sure, precisely.
Thanks for that. Then, okay, that leads us to the sixth point where you were writing that what we need to do is to promote domestic social policies to ensure freedom from material need. Now, this is a huge topic, freedom of material need. I mean, yeah, we've been dreaming of that for the last couple of 1,000 years. But so how would the promotion of domestic social policies then help? And where does does diplomacy come in on this aspect?
Right. Well, So the reality of globalization is that domestic, social, and economic policies today are foreign policies as well. If we don't address critical problems like inequality and poverty at home, what we'll end up getting is populists, ultranationalists, racists, fascists winning seats in our legislatures and gaining positions in our governments more and more. So if these kind of forces of hate overwhelm even some countries that have significant power in the international system, it'll make it all but impossible to address these key issues that I've been identifying problems, everything from climate to massive job losses as a result of automation to the future breakout of superintelligence. So as automation and AI replace more and more human jobs in the years ahead, we need a safety net, a better safety net for workers. So some form of universal basic income, or UBI, which the technology entrepreneur Andrew Yang campaigned for when he ran for president of the United States earlier in 2020. So UBI by itself, at least initially, may not be a high standard of living for folks left unemployed by technological change. Yang proposed $1,000 a month at first. But as people who lose jobs to automation find new jobs in the gig economy that may pay less, or where their flow of gigs may be very uneven from one month to the next, it will cut the risk that these folks won't be able to pay their monthly bills. And UBI may be easier for government to pay for than it looks at first. Yang proposes paying for it with a VAT, or a sales tax, consumption tax. And okay, that sounds regressive at first, but automation and AI, if you think about it, are likely to keep bringing the cost of consumer goods down, which would offset the impact of higher sales tax on the poor and on the working class. In coming decades, I think we're going to see automation and AI as taking away more and more jobs, meaning more and more people will rely on some form of UBI. But even if we pay for it through income taxes, consider this, that the salaries of people who keep their jobs, who are likely going to be the folks who design AI systems and manage robots and so forth, their salaries are likely to go way up. So even just those folks paying their fair share of income tax should lead to higher overall tax revenue for governments that they could then distribute to the population at large through UBI. Now, a lot of moving parts here. Yeah, I get that. But the point is that UBI shouldn't strike fear into the hearts of deficit hawks. And deficit hawks like me, I'm worried about budget deficits and what that will eventually do to the national accounts of every country, including the United States. But this does not have to be a budget buster.
No, I mean you've got me on that one. I'm a social democrat, and I'm a very left-wing one. I believe that even if necessary, just print it. But okay, maybe there we disagree. The point is, once you have robots who manage other robots, the question is, yeah, I mean, how do we get the money into our hands in order to still then pay for the goods that might still be priced? But thank you very much for this idea. I mean, that's also where I see the value of your book, right? You're going beyond just state-to-state diplomacy. You're opening up the discussion and connecting the international with the local and the social, which I think is really a way forward of looking at global diplomacy. Maybe to the last point that you're making, or kind of the way that you're trying to approach your readers, to say, like, we need to put public diplomacy in the service of resolving technology issues. And maybe just as a background here, I mean, public diplomacy refers to the state or statesmen or representatives talking to foreign populations, right? And trying to appeal to other populations in order to get their agendas across or make it acceptable, right? And so why would you use this in the service of resolving technology issues?
Yeah, well, so one of the realities of diplomacy today and diplomacy in the future is that the global public now participate in it fully and in real time. So if the diplomacy we do need to manage technological change is going to work, it's got to keep the public informed and on board. And I really think of the global public. So we're talking about communicating to foreign publics, but also to domestic publics about foreign policy as well. That's part of public diplomacy. Good public diplomacy generates legitimacy for government and for corporate diplomats, because they do it too. And this is really important generally in an open democratic society, but it's also important when diplomats need to conduct negotiations in private. I mean, that's still done, and that's not going to go away. That's always going to have to happen on some occasions. Diplomats will to have secret talks, but the public need to be on board with their general objectives, and need to understand their general objectives. So there needs to be more transparency in the process, more opportunities for public input, for comment and direct participation for a full range of people, of interest groups, and that it's not just about wealthy lobbyists who can get an appointment with the foreign minister or the foreign minister's assistant, to press their case. And the process needs to be multi-channel. It's traditional media is still important, but also online and social media are key now and are just only going to become more so. And also importantly, it's got to be bi-directional. It's not just about a government or a company saying this is what we're doing. It involves listening as well as transmitting, like a dialogue, a conversation. And one thing that needs to happen is that governments, certain governments in particular, need to stop using social media to vilify the multilateral institutions that were set up specifically to make diplomacy between governments easier. So institutions like the United Nations, like the WTO, like the European Union. Some governments, as you were pointing out before, find it very easy to blame these institutions for their own domestic economic and political problems. So that's what gave us Brexit. That's what gave us Trump's war on the WTO. So for their part, all of these institutions realize that they have to do public diplomacy better to communicate with the global public, to expand popular participation and legitimacy. But they can't do it by themselves enough to stop this populist surge. Others need to take a role in that too, domestic governments and civil society in particular.
So those are kind of the 7 ways in which you try to then tie in your analysis. And I must say again, I mean, this is preceded by quite a long, quite a few chapters of where you're trying to explain how these shifts that have been happening in the last 20 years, basically, are now informing the need for these points that you've been explaining, right?
Yes. Exactly. It's the lead up to this. How did we get here, and what are the various moving parts? I mean, talk about everything from the debates about how capitalism evolves and ends, or if it ends, everything up to the sort of specific mechanics of trade policies and trade diplomacy up to the present time, and to give us a platform to then look forward and think about some policy solutions, approaches to these big problems.
Wonderful. Maybe a very last point, just in your estimation, do you think that there is good reasons for optimism, or there is more reason for being alert about what is happening at the moment? Are you optimist or a pessimist about the immediate future of technology and diplomacy?
Well, that's a hard question to answer. I mean, I guess by nature, in my nature, I'm an optimist, or I wouldn't have attempted to write this book, because I felt it was important to make a contribution to the public debate about these issues and how to go about solving them. I think we're again at a sort of a critical point within this series of critical points in these years, in this decade, whatever. But right now we are at a critical point where there's everything to play for. So how people vote in democratic societies, how governments cooperate to resist the authoritarian encroachments of others, I think are really important. And whether we sit down and recommit to taking the steps we need to do on climate right now, diplomatically and in practice, it's an urgent matter. And just this year, this month, it's out there, and the tech is working with us on climate. If that's agenda item number one, I mean, you look at how much faster the adoption of solar and wind power has taken place than we thought might have been possible 10 or 15 years ago, and how much more affordable it has become. So technology is making our jobs easier in this, but we have to recommit to it now. And get everyone on board. And this means, for example, for the United States, rejoining the Paris Accord and reaffirming a commitment to the Paris Accord's goals and objectives.
So we'll continue to negotiate our economic future.
Indeed, we shall. Dio volente, inshallah. We can only hope. We've got to be there and do that. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jeff. Let's end it on this very optimistic note. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you soon in a next interview.
Well, thank you, Pascal. Very much appreciate spending this time with you.
Good night, everybody.